So, on to the first question, which is something that I think a lot of people have been asking. This is, I think, the thing people have asked the most, and that would be, what do you consider to be the top reasons why grants are not successful?
Time. You didn't put in the time. Number one, you didn't commit the time to find the funding opportunities. You didn't commit the time to write it well. You didn't commit the time to get feedback from your peers and colleagues.
Yeah, I would say it's you didn't get them excited, the reviewers, or even one reviewer, that this is a project that needs to be done, that this is going to make a difference, that spending limited dollars on this project. It just didn't rise to that level of getting a champion in review or just really exciting people.
Um, let's let's get off the grant for just a second and get to the reviewers. We had this question came in from a couple people. How do you best deal with the criticisms given to you by the reviewers on your grant if those criticisms don't offer concrete suggestions?
Well, it's interesting. I want to point out that NIH policy changed over the last few years, and they are encouraging the reviewers not to give suggestions. In fact, what they say is it's not your job as the reviewer to write the resubmission for them. That makes it really difficult for applicants, so I really understand where that question comes from. What you have to do is look at what they think is wrong and talk to your peers and colleagues about how you might be able to fix it. Primarily, it's in the approach. Would that be your experience, Jacob, that the approach is most criticized?
Yeah, and there's, again, as I mentioned, pretty much anything can get your grant taken out of contention. So sometimes it's very minor things. I mean, but we both smiled, and I think that's because we were thinking of a long list of things you shouldn't do. So you shouldn't take it personally. You shouldn't get angry, and you certainly shouldn't write a rebuttal to the program manager or to the review panel, because when you put your resubmission in, you're probably going to get the same group of people, and now they have a chip on their shoulder for you being uh, critical of them. What you should do is to take a second to let it sink in and to really see what you can draw out of that. And talking to your peers at your friends at your institution, the other people you put the grant together with. All right, what didn't we do? Well, how did we not make things clear? And most of the time, there's things that you you relied on the trust us, as Peg said. It's that how could they think we don't have the resources? If you didn't spell it out, then it wasn't there, and they don't aren't required to consider it. So just take them all as anything that they say. Assume that it's helpful, use it as helpful, and just try and make sure that they can't make that same criticism the next time when it goes bad.
Well, to that end, and staying on the reviewers for a minute, here's a question that I actually was amused by when it came in, but honestly it's a little taboo, but it's something I've kind of always wondered as well. Um, do all of your reviewers actually read the proposal? These proposals are long, they're dense, they're filled with data. Um, do you ever, is it a valid feeling to feel like they're not even really reading this?
Well, there certainly are going to be reviewers on the review panel that don't. Some panels have 20, 30, 40 grants more that are being reviewed simultaneously. So each grant will be given a lead reviewer. You often three people in the review committee are responsible for really making your grant a priority, reading it carefully, and then the discussion. Everybody else has the option, has access to it, but they don't have to give it that sort of thorough reading. And then in discussion, the leads that are most responsible can bring it up or not. But as we've both discussed, the reading can be done under less than ideal circumstances. We're very busy and we're trying to get it in when we can. So people miss stuff, and that's just a fact of life. It does happen. So if there's something important you can say it more than once. You need to make it clear. Put it in a figure. put it in bold, use formatting as best you can, and just expect that that's gonna happen. That people might miss minor details. Although these are, obviously all very smart individuals who are scientists themselves, so attention to detail is part of their daily activity.
One of the definitions of grantsmanship is the packaging and presentation of the idea. So if you've packaged it well, presented it well, so it's hard for them to miss things. You've got clear organizational structure, but still, even you can do the best job possible and they'll miss stuff. I've had reviewers say you didn't address X, which meant that they didn't read an entire page and a half of my proposal. So.
And there's really not a whole lot you can do about that at that point, is there?
No, at that point you can't, and you have to be really cautious when you come back to the program officers when you want to complain about the reviewers. Because quite often the program officer picked those reviewers, and by proxy, you're kind of insulting your program officer by insulting the reviewer. So if you have a legitimate issue, such as an error of fact or a full page and a half that they didn't read, you can point this out respectfully, but you really do want to be careful.
So it needs to be pretty serious for a grant review to complain about something. I think it's different than a publication, which you can argue for when that publication's in review and comes back with a factual error.
Yeah.
So let's get on to a completely different topic, no longer looking at the reviewers themselves. This is a very specific question, but I think a lot of people might not have considered it. How do you feel about grants that are based on data gathering types of experiments instead of hypothesis-driven experiments? And the example this person gives is various omics technologies, genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, where the goal is really just gather the data, publish the data, and not discover something new. It's still a valid scientific process that requires money, but you can't really say that you've got a hypothesis you're testing. What are some recommendations for that?
So, especially if you're going to NIH, there is such a, what's the word I want to use that's not pejorative? An expectation of hypothesis-driven work. And that kind of omics work can be incredibly valuable. I mean, I'm even thinking back to Nusslein Volhard, who did that incredible array of Drosophila mutations back before omics was even possible. And so much work has come and been possible based on that. You have all these data. Now you can generate hypotheses because you have the data. But to get this stuff funded as a pure omics, that's the only thing you're going to do in the grant period, is extraordinarily difficult. Again, they're looking for hypotheses. But they're also, one way to think about it is, what's the system that you're interested in? And what questions do you have? What do you have something solid on that you can actually do? You've already got some data about it. You can at least have one line of experiments that's following your early results, and then talk about how the omics results would feed back into those data or into that experimental structure. It's also really important, if you're going to do that, to discuss how you're going to choose which of these results that you're going to follow. Like an explicit discussion of that is absolutely necessary. So generally what I recommend people try to do is kind of a hybridized application where you have a central question and you have one line that you've got data on that you think is going to work, but then in the background, or as aim 3, you've got the omics going on, starting on day 1, and a plan for how the results from that are going to feed into your experimental questions. That's what I advise people to do.
My advice is actually, I think, an answer to more than just this question, maybe a number of the other questions, which is to make sure that whatever you're proposing is a match to the call, the RFA, the FOA, the ARBA, whatever it is. The call for proposals will tell you what they're looking for, and you need to give them that. It doesn't matter if you have a cure for cancer and you send it in to the NSF exobiology group, then they're not going to fund it. That's not their job. You need to see what they're looking for, which is usually spelled out very clearly early on in the announcement, and occasionally they are looking for just biological data collections or some such, but otherwise hypothesis-driven research is really the the primary focus of most agencies. And so if you can make a case that a data-driven, entirely data-driven effort is the key to doing that, then that's great, but it's got to match the call.
Okay, great. This is another question that I like because I think it ensures that we don't exclude early career scientists in our discussion here. As you know, grants go to people who have demonstrated not only that their work is interesting, but that they are uniquely qualified to be the ones to do that work. But in the case of an early career scientist where they don't yet have the accolades that a late career scientist would, or they can't say that I'm the best one in the world to look at this, or even one of the best, I am someone who is just starting my own lab and doesn't really yet have a lot of publications. How can early career scientists kind of beef up that part of their application?
Well, there's a lot of attention on early career scientists. Everybody recognizes that they are the future, and it's very important that they be brought into the field and supported through it. So there are many grant mechanisms that are specifically for junior faculty or transition from postdoctoral or graduate student into independent researcher. There's a lot of foundation awards that are only for junior faculty, and everyone is aware of the different stages of one's career so that people get evaluated based on how they're doing in that stage. You can get started on grant writing very early on. You should be involved in grant writing as a graduate student, not necessarily as a PI, but be on grants or know how they're written with your advisor. You can get awards and accolades. You can get publications. So if you are an exceptional graduate student and have published well as a postdoc, then you will review well in putting in your first independent grant. And similarly, if there are smaller grants, you can compete for seed funding internally even. That looks good. You can go for the Mentor K awards at the NIH or the R21 awards or smaller ones, or be a co-PI on somebody else's awards. So there's lots of ways to get some demonstration of your abilities and fundability at any stage in your career.
Yeah, I think reviewers look at when you graduated. I mean, that's one of the first heuristics on the biosketch, right, is how long has this person been in the field? For young faculty members in their first faculty position, I think often to be competitive, they have to demonstrate that they've done work on their own without their mentor. Right? So they've got to have preliminary data at minimum that they generated in their new environment. Ideally, they get at least one paper out if it's a newish field for them. And again, that establishes their independence. It establishes that they can take a project on their own from conception to publication. And I've actually seen people lose tenure because they waited for the Cell, Science, or Nature paper. They'd sat on their data and they didn't get it out, and you can't do that. Don't worry too hard about the impact factor of your journal when you're just starting out. Start getting your stories out. Start learning how to write these on your own, manage the whole project on your own.
So staying on the general topic of not forgetting the little guy, someone has asked here, what are some tips and strategies for small nonprofit organizations to be competitive in obtaining grant funding when their competitors are all these much larger institutions with much greater resources?
Oh. Nonprofits are tough. Jacob and I are mostly used to the world of research. I did spend a little bit of time in that world, and personal relationships are pretty much necessary. Unless it's a general call for proposals that's reviewed independently, the best thing that nonprofit can do is build the personal relationships with their potential funders so they can see the value of what they do. And the storytelling is so important there, but the storytelling has to be backed by concrete data, and often a group will be more competitive if they have a plan to evaluate the effectiveness of whatever it is they propose to do and explicitly say in the grant that they're going to report back to their funder what the results were from the funding they received.
Right. Smaller nonprofits also very often get funded by private foundations, some of which exclusively fund the smaller organizations in social services in particular. And so again, because with foundation work, personal relationships is very important. Getting an introduction to a program manager and getting them to know what you do. Partnerships are also a good way to get started if you're a smaller nonprofit that doesn't have all of the resources, even the resources to manage and administer a grant. You can partner with a university or with a larger group and just be a subcontractor or a co-investigator on a grant. That's a good way to get started and build up again a track record of having received and managed grants.
So you touched on this briefly, and I think we only have time for one final question, and it'll be this one. But a number of people have actually asked this question. It's a good one. The alternative strategies part of a grant seems to be a strange part of a grant, because you need to say, here are all the ways in which my experiments are likely to fail, and here's what I'll do if they fail. How do you balance saying, here's what's likely to fail, and saying, I'm not likely to fail?
So there's two things that I want to say. One is, if you've got 9 bullet points of potential problems, by number 7, I'm pretty convinced it's not going to work. So you don't go overboard in talking about the potential problems. You really want to think, what they show reviewers is that you are a good investment because you have thought through what could go wrong and can potentially fix it. And you should write it always in conditional language. So, what we, through the company that I work for, recommend that you do is that you essentially say what you think could go wrong, why you don't think it's probable, and then what you would do if it were to go wrong. So, it's not confession, it's not every detail, but it is demonstrating that you've thought about it and that if it doesn't work perfectly, you're going to be okay.
I mean, it's very important that you do address those issues. I've seen plenty of grants come back that the negative criticism was that every aim depends on the one before, and that you didn't address what would happen if it didn't work out the way you wanted it. And certainly, if you're 100% confident everything is going to work out the way you want it, then it's not research, right? There's nothing novel there if you already know the answer. So you have to accept some amount of uncertainty and just have a plan for dealing with it. You're going to be getting funding maybe for 3 or 5 years. Surprises are going to come up. Just think about what are the different options. You don't have to necessarily present it as a failure. It's just different possible paths along the way. If this happens, then we'll do this. If this happens, then we'll do this. And if you can express that regardless of what happens, interesting, valuable information will be learned, then that's usually the best situation.